Hello? Yes, that sounds better. Dear members of the Shanghai Archaeological Forum, colleagues, and friends, thank you most sincerely for this great honor, which I accept with humility, recognizing the contributions of the many collaborators, students, and yes, you anonymous reviewers who have challenged me to do my best work. It has been indeed a great privilege to attend the Shanghai Archaeological Forum, which has deepened my appreciation for the remarkable and fine scholarship represented here around the globe, and especially from China. Something exceedingly special has been meeting the many young women and men who are now entering the profession of archaeology in China and from China. They're enthusiastic and have remarkable, excellent potential. I urge all of us to celebrate gender and other diversity in the conduct of archaeological research, wherever it occurs. What I'd like to do with this lecture is go back to the beginning of it. Okay, so what I'd like to do with this lecture is briefly define archaeology, present some case studies, as you see there, which will include traveling to the classic Maya world in the first two examples, moving to archaic Greece where my current research is, and then a few words about ancient tuberculosis in the Americas. As with many of us, when we learned about this honor, my original reaction was, why me? What brought this on? But I think probably what is the major impetus is this little term I coined in 1977, bioarchaeology. I was more concerned about the approach at that time than the term, but I consider archaeology to be a problem-oriented field. And when I entered it, there was a lot of ritual behavior in digging and measuring, and I was more interested in the people who had been there in the past and learning about them. So as I always say, what is bioarchaeology? Is it the study of human bones from archaeological sites? No. Context is crucial, whether it's historical or archaeological. We're talking about the people. So it is the study of past people. It's problem-oriented and it's focused on individual and group histories. It's informed by archaeological and historical context. It can be scientific or humanistic. It addresses numerous topics ranging from ethnicity and political formations to diet and health. And it strives for transdisciplinarity, which I mean to be bringing the past to the present, not just moving across disciplines, but bringing our knowledge of deep change in the human condition to today's world and today's diverse problems. So in the 21st century, bioarchaeology has taken a number of forms and moved to challenges that range from violence, studying violence, to the bioarchaeology of care. And I think there's strength in diversity. So all these different approaches I find very stimulating. I do want to recognize my UK colleagues and others who use the term a little differently, deriving from Graham Clark's work at Star Carr, who at that point talked about bioarchaeology in terms of faunal remains, and it's been extended to all organic materials. And we'll pause to think of Graham Clark in a friendly way. And the bioarchaeology has gone global. The term is used in many languages and even Chinese today. It's in Webster's New World Medical Dictionary, and there are jobs, which my students find to be a welcoming concept. Now, the first case study I want to talk about is Hanab Pakal at the site of Palenque. He was arguably the most powerful ruler there. His remains were studied in the 50s, 70s, and we returned there in 1999. If you're going to come to the tomb, the elaborate tomb within the Temple of the Inscriptions, you move up a very high staircase and slither down a very wet one into a tomb that contains a remarkably carved crypt headstone that pictures Hanab Pakal at the center of the Maya world, providing fertility for all that existed during that time. If you take away the headstone and remove the inset from the crypt, you will recover and view the remains of Pakal, and as typical in the Maya world, not terribly well preserved. The question is really, are the historical sources right? Was this Hanab Pakal? The physical anthropologists estimated his age at death as between 40 and 50 years. But he became history as the epigraphers were able to translate birth and death dates. And they argued that he lived 80.4 years. So if he lived only 40 to 50 years, perhaps this wasn't Pakal. So you had the epigraphers, the archaeologists, and the bioanthropologists all taking sides. Now, the Mexican physical anthropologists chose to focus on evidence from the skull. Although at that time there were methods looking at the pubic symphysis for estimating age at death. But this part of the body was not recovered in the 1950s. We returned in 1999, and we found buried under some artifacts, indeed, the informative pubic symphyses, which were encased in various forms of artifactual residue and other material. And we had a wonderful conservator, and I have a deep respect now, even more so for conservators who managed to clean these bones so we could observe them. And we applied traditional techniques, and we, like the Mexican physical anthropologists, could only say that the individual was around, or maybe more than 50 years of age. But one of my students, always delving into the novel and the new, was developing a method called the transition analysis. And he was able to propose a method that would allow us to date or to estimate ages at death well beyond 50 years with precision. And so he and I sent him pictures, I looked at the bones at the site. Neither of us trained each other, but we came up with the remarkably similar estimates of a cloud of points, the middle of which was 80.9 years, not 40 to 50, which demonstrated to my mind something that I hadn't expected, which was that the epigraphers were right, and the archaeologists and physical anthropologists that believed those remains were younger were wrong. We'll now move a little further south to the Maya site of Copan. And this site contains a number of remarkable structures, one called the Acropolis, after, of course, the well-known Greek structure of the same name. The Acropolis was cut by the Rio Copan, the river of Copan, in the early 20th century. And so the archaeologists have tunneled into the site with their equipment and their materials in order to investigate the site from the inside out. The site includes a number of structures that have been killed or destroyed and buried. It also contains the fully buried structure, the Rosalila tomb, which was buried intact and is reconstructed in the sculpture garden there. But you have 7 rebuildings of sequentially larger structures. We, however, were down in the base looking at the very oldest materials from Copan. This is the famous altar cue from Copan that shows ruler 1 giving the badge of office, that is validating ruler 16. Ruler 1 is said to have arrived at Copan in 426 AD. I arrived at Copan to attempt to resolve a controversy about ruler 2, however. Ruler 2 had 2 competing university interpretations or identifications of his tomb. Harvard on the one side, the University of Pennsylvania on the other. And they asked me to see what I could do with the magic of bioarchaeological science to help resolve this. So we went into the most elaborate tomb at the site. That's the Margarita Tomb, no gendering intended. The tomb was said to be the son of ruler 1 by the University of Pennsylvania folks based on the fact it was the most elaborate tomb with the most grave goods. Now, the problem occurred when I crawled out on this fragile structure above the remains to view them, and I noticed in the pelvis that the structures of the pelvis, we call this the greater sciatic notch, was broad, very feminine. In fact, the whole skeleton was feminine, and she was a female. So either the second ruler was a woman, hypothesis I like, or this was certainly not ruler 2, the son of ruler 1. We go on to Harvard's entry into the ruler 2 sweepstakes, who is buried under Copan's hieroglyphic staircase in the Matmat, so-called Matmat tomb, very well preserved, with a headstone of unusual shape that shows the image of ruler 1 speaking to ruler 2. What about the remains? Well, the remains were supposed to be those of a 40 to 50-year-old male. However, they were youthful. The individual hadn't lived past the 30th year. And more than that, they too showed feminine features. So I'm afraid that neither one of these tombs, however interesting, were that of ruler 2, assuming that ruler 2 was a male. The bottom line here, of course, is don't estimate gender or sex, biological sex, in burials based on tomb architecture, grave goods. The tomb attributed to ruler 1 was that indeed of a male, and we knew that from inscriptions, or we inferred that from inscriptions, royal treatments, inlays of the teeth, artifacts, and so on. He had suffered a lot of blunt force trauma in his long life, including fractures that are common to the forearm, others I'd never seen before, a fracture in the shoulder, his thorax, his whole chest area had been impacted by something, and some of my doctor friends say he looked like he'd been in an automobile accident and been the driver with the steering wheel impaled. I thought that was interesting, but probably not a useful interpretation. He was probably either a ball or both, a ball player or a warrior, but he had survived extreme blunt force trauma before he died. Now the question, another question the archaeologists are very concerned about at Copan is external influences. And every so often, archaeologists will propose that there is a great great influence. Perhaps people were being sent out from the Valley of Mexico, or perhaps the young proto-rulers were being sent there to learn their craft. Why do they think this? Well, for example, in the case of Yaxcucmo, his name is spelled out on the nearby tomb structure or altar structure. Here you read Knish Yaxcucmo. This is in the tabloid tablero style of Mexico. And there are other artifactual links around the Maya world, including the Valley of Mexico, in portable art and material culture. The Margarita Tomb, which is spoken of perhaps as a pilgrimage center, has this, what we call the Dazzler ceramic, that also looks like it's from the Valley of Mexico. Another interment is called the Taluk Warrior because he wears the goggles and other paraphernalia from the Valley of Mexico, or of the gods that are common to the Valley of Mexico. And then the Matmat tomb looks more like some round tombs from Mexico. And she has not only herself at the base of the tomb, another skull and vertebrae of the neck that look like they've been decapitated. And then there were 3 other skulls higher in the tomb. So we took on this opportunity to address the question of outside influences by looking for evidence of patterns of human migration, colonization, and residential mobility. And we did that by looking at chemical signatures that are translated into the human body, into the teeth, into the bone, through groundwater. So your teeth are a signature, a chemical signature of where you lived while those teeth were forming young in your history. And the bones are more recent evidence. And there's considerable variation across the Maya world in terms of bedrock signatures carried up through groundwater. So what we find is that a number of burials were local, but those that have the initials there, the Matmat burial, the skull at the base of the tomb, the Taluk Warrior, and Yaxcucmo are from out of town, as those red triangles indicate. Were they from the Valley of Mexico? No, it looks like they came from the north. The Yaxcucmo perhaps from the coast, and then via the magnificent site of Tikal, but not from the Valley of Mexico. So the epigraphers and I have had some interesting conversations, but I stand firm on what I believe of this. We'll now take a brief turn to the old world, to Greece and some of my current work. I find that Lord Renfrew and I have something in common. We've returned to Greece for some research that we're engaged in now. The Phaleron Archaeological Project derives from remains from the coast of Attica. This is the first port of Athens, as Athens was becoming the basis for state formation. Now, the Narcos Foundation decided to build a library and a park and other facilities, and an opera house there, and it looks very impressive by night. But before they decided to do this, or as they were deciding to do this on what they thought was fairly sterile land, lo and behold, in the testing, they discovered there was a vast cemetery there, which was excavated by the Greek ministry. And Stella Chrysoulaki did a really remarkable salvage job. It was excavated between 2012 and 2015. And they took the bodies, as you'll see in a minute, out in block, actually 3 blocks for each body. 1,500 bodies times 3. So that's an interesting figure to try and deal with. This dates from about the late geometric period to the end of the classic period, beginning of the classic period, 320 BC. The site is famous for some of these mass graves. There are 76 individuals who were buried with their arms over their head, shackled. And they are, we find the remains of the shackles. And of course, we want to know about them, but we want to know about the other 1,400 individuals interred at the site. And we will be comparing those with elites that are buried in sites such as Keramikos. But this is the first large cemetery of non-elite individuals. And it gives us a tremendous opportunity to look at those that were buried in graves just dug into the sand, as most of them were, some cremated, some in vessels, and a very few non-human remains. We have horses and relatives of theirs buried in the site as well. Many of the children are buried in ceramic vessels, as you see there, and or buried with ceramic vessels, which we're happy about because the ceramics are going to be much more important in estimating time than radiocarbon dating, because we're in that awful plateau just before 2,000 years ago. So we're collaborating very heavily with the ceramicists. And I see Barbara Mills smiling. This is what we were facing in as we enter the conservation stage. Again, 1,500 times 3 means a lot of blocks to conserve and pots to excavate. And we've been busy at that for most of the interim time. But our question maintains, who are the people of Phaleron? We're looking at these blocks of bone very carefully for positioning to see if the clavicles of the shoulders look like they were pulled upright and the individuals were crucified. We're looking very carefully and recording where the ribs occurred in the body, not frequently the case. And these are fragmented, so we wouldn't recover that normally in archaeological context. We can see where there is blunt force trauma on the body very precisely. We can look at the interior aspect to look for patterning of reaction in the ribs to tuberculosis, infectious disease, and cancers that present differently. We, of course, are doing typical osteobiography, looking at gender sex ratios, looking at biological sex, both through proteomics and through morphology, and also age at death. And interestingly, though, these 3 rows of sacrifices are indeed all male, as we estimate today, they range in age from fairly young to older individuals, mostly young. But now with that approach that George Milner and colleagues have perfected, we can look at older age groups. The size variation is rather remarkable. And you see there large males buried by small ones. And we've estimated stature. And indeed, there is quite a bit of inherited variation. And we wonder how kin relations have structured the cemetery and where these people are from. And we're looking at that, which is a question we ask of many of our cemeteries. We'll be doing strontium isotope ratios to look at origins. We're looking at areas of muscle attachments and their development to determine who were the rowers and who were those that labored for the beginning of the Greek state. We'll also be looking at areas of muscle attachment on the hands to identify the women that were weavers versus those that were engaged in other activities. And we will be looking at other evidence, arthritis, and also areas of bony reaction. What we found here is some new evidence of bone remodeling, which we just discovered, which makes it look like people were shackled. There's evidence of infection due to shackles on the legs. Some of those not buried in the mass graves present evidence of blunt force trauma that was healed. We're using this as an opportunity to look at cancers globally. And we're doing systematic screening rather than just looking at cases. In looking at juveniles who present evidence of scurvy, for example, that lipping on the growing long bones shows up in x-rays and looks just like the scurvy scars we see today. Thalassemia is present as well. We see the evidence in the bones, in the spine, in the very porous skulls. And this, of course, we're studying, and we're looking at this as an attempt to explore malaria, as it was selected for in these cases of hemolytic anemia. And we'll be looking at genetics and doing ancient DNA there. I'll quickly run through the last case here, the ancient tuberculosis in the Americas. This is something I've been studying all my career, and it's been a very interesting journey. The bones in our area of Illinois, where I began work, show evidence of lesions in the spine, which could be a number of different pathologies. In fact, a fairly daunting list. I've done a differential diagnosis. We've looked for specific diseases that are most likely, looking at the tissue, that is resorptive lesions, the individual lesions that occur on joint surfaces outside the spine. We look at the population features and note a number of young adult deaths. And then we look at environment and culture and note that these occur in high population aggregates and throughout the country. So with that in mind, I published on this being tuberculosis, but the pesky little medical doctors said, no, it couldn't be. So this meant I took my research project to South America, where there was skeletal evidence and desiccated soft tissue to aid in the venture. We know that tuberculosis affects a variety of mammals, not just humans, but rodents, and also a number of other species. It was said before genetics that this occurred in humans who acquired the disease from herd animals in the Mediterranean. But we know now that the human forms are much older. And we know this because we have increasingly less complex forms in other animals. So instead of ourselves receiving that in the Mediterranean, it appears that the cows should blame us for tuberculosis. Our global history suggests that tuberculosis evolved first in Africa, moved out of Africa into Asia, and we thought across the Bering Land Bridge to the Americas. Deletions occurred for severity of the disease, and that disease spread throughout the world. We then developed a hypothesis that the disease should be most closely related to the form in Asia, which is why I've been very interested in studying tuberculosis-like disease here. We've used the latest methods for identifying the disease and have discovered molecular examples that we can sequence precisely from South America. Now, the trick is that these turn out to be the forms that we find in the humans. Are most closely related to the seal and pinniped forms, which we didn't expect at all. I've got 3 more slides, just let me go. So Nature magazine believes in us, but this is a whole different dimension. So our lessons from the study of disease for globalization studies is that infectious disease track population movement. We should be thinking about that. Some infectious diseases jump species easily. We should be thinking about that today. And pandemic diseases are difficult to eradicate. even in the antibiotic era. So, thank you very much for your attention. And I offer my...
Many thanks, Professor Jain, for your excellent lecture.